Redditors who lived in countries that no longer exist, like Yugoslavia, Czechoslovakia, etc. What was it like to see your country break up? Well, Czechoslovakia divided into Czech and Slovak Republic, and honestly it's pretty much the same. The languages are almost identical and there is pretty much no difference between the two countries, except for the fact that Czechia is bigger and has a little bit better economy. Source: I'm from Slovakia. Reddit. For everyone asking about the details of split, please read this article. I can confirm this. Source: I'm from Czech. Wow, platinum, thank you kind stranger. I was born in Yugoslavia, mid-80s. It was sad. I lived in a major city largely untouched by direct attack, but we had all three major ethnicities heavily represented, and it was incredibly confusing as to why friends stopped being friends, families broke up, etc. As kids we understood what was happening, but not why. I remember hiding my next door Muslim neighbor when the military police came. I remember being embarrassed of who I was, even though my family lineage has mixed roots. I remember weeks without electricity, without running water, doing homework by candlelight, military rations, one bottle of oil to last months. Flour was scarce. The river would carry sounds of gunfire and explosions. I saw my dad only a few times in 5 years. Afterwards I remember thinking that was lucky. Some didn't see their dads at all. I remember my dad spending what little time he had at home teaching me how to use various guns, just in case. Afterwards, some people lost their minds. One of the soldiers was convinced the enemy was still there, ever present. He would place small explosives that looked like canned food in the cupboards, where his wife and kids were, in his mind to protect them. A couple drank themselves to death. I always believed they died in the forest outside the town years ago. Businesses closed, factories were empty. There was still work for some, but no pay. The currency was worthless. You get paid sometimes, in the morning, and by the afternoon it wasn't even enough for a roll of toilet paper. Weird scary times. Air raid sirens would interrupt soccer games. I remember wondering why I couldn't see some of my friends. Explanations back then didn't make sense. They still don't. For the people that lived, worked, and played together, we never wanted that choice. It was pushed on us, manipulated us, played to our fears and insecurities. Maybe it would have happened eventually regardless. My friend's mother was a student when it all happened. Still to this day she won't eat lentils ever, because she spent so long eating lentils only. We emigrated from the USSR about a year before it broke up, so technically I'm a Soviet. What makes everything more complicated is that we are from Crimea, which was recently annexed by Russia. I opened a new bank account a while back, and one of the details I had to fill is where I'm originally from. It was an electronic form with a menu. No option to select USSR, and pick either Ukraine or Russia would be taking a political standpoint. It was a very weird experience. Till place of birth forms need and it's complicated option. I lived in Moscow before the USSR got dissolved. One thing that was jarring in the aftermath was the emergence of a lot of Western chains we previously had no exposure to. I remember going to my first McDonald's in 1991. A funny anecdote I heard is that the service staff had to be trained to act more friendly, like they would in American restaurants. To be fair, it was a stressful and uncertain period. A funny anecdote I heard is that the service staff had to be trained to act more friendly, like they would in American restaurants. Yes. Then, they had to train them to not act as friendly because it was creeping people out. My parents lived in Bosnia before the Yugoslavian war. They finished building their family home for them and my siblings who were babies back then in 1988 or 1989. And now imagine being forced to move away from your newly built life with 2 young children a year later. I was born in Austria in 1992, and I remember being poor as a child, poor but happy. My mother's educational degrees were not to be found / were not accepted in Austria, basically restricting her possible jobs to being a cleaning lady after being the manager of a Yugoslavian market chain. I remember the first time we visited the old house after the war in 1998 I think. I remember seeing the house full of bullet holes, one corner of the house blown away by tank grenades. I remember finding my brother's old toys trampled into the dirt in the front yard. I remember my mother finding an old dress of hers in their former bedroom, hardened by the exposure to the element. I vividly remember her sitting on the stairs in front of the main entrance, silently crying. My point is, it is often not so much about seeing your country break apart, but much rather about seeing the life, dreams, and hopes you left behind drop like the old green velvet dress she loved so much. Sorry for mobile upload. Edit. Wow, I didn't expect this to gain so many upvotes. I guess a lot of people have had similar experiences in their own or their relatives' lives and or can relate. Thanks a lot for the awards. I have very similar memories. My parents were in the process of building a 3-story house when the war broke out. The inside was mostly completed, they just needed to finish the interior attic and put siding on the house, stucco. My brother was supposed to receive the entire attic as his room, and he was very excited. We fled, left the house behind. When we went back to visit years later, we found the house in disrepair with refugees squatting in it. The refugees were actually very nice, and I remember one of them was a hairdresser, and she offered to do my mother's hair. We visited them several times, and I remember sitting on the porch in front of the house cleaning fresh green beans with them one day. The house had been stripped of all copper. Looters pulled out all of the pipes from the wall, and all of the wiring. There were several holes where snipers had shot, and a large hole blown into the second story where either a grenade or artillery shell had hit the house. The refugees had patched the hole with mismatched bricks they found. They also tried to do some little repairs inside the house. Some years later we went to visit again, and the original refugees squatting at the house had moved. I hope they found a better place. New squatters were occupying the house. These squatters were mean and hostile, and wouldn't talk to us, or let us in. My dad, who has a temper, was really kind to them. A lot of people were surprised and asked why he'd let some squatter be rude with him, and my dad basically felt bad for them and said they're just desperate and scared. He said to look at the conditions they are living in. They're afraid they'll lose even that if we kick them out. The last time we visited, and for the years since then, no one was squatting in the house, and it lays empty. The roof had started to go, so my dad paid for a new roof to be installed. We all thought it was a waste of money, but I think it was a sentimental thing for him. The house is still there. It's large, solid, it can be repaired. Will it ever be repaired? Likely not. But I think he holds on to that in his dreams and hopes of restoring the house he built one day. I was born at the end of the Bosnian War, 1995. Following the breakup of Yugoslavia, CCA 1992, so I can't remember the breakup, but I remember the post-breakup/post-war years, having very little money. The city, Sarajevo, was bombed to cheers, and 95% of buildings either had bullet holes or were torn down. I remember watching German channels like Togo and all the cool toys the German kids had that you couldn't buy in my country at the time. My dad drove a Yugo 55. Google it. The bodywork on that car was full of shrapnel holes. He replaced the engine. Later, my dad did the bodywork on the car himself, but he didn't have money for car paint, so he painted it with paint used for mailboxes. No supermarkets, only small stores and markets. Now the country looks and feels like any other European country, but back then it was a whole different story. Also, another thing that pops into my head from my childhood is all the mines. The country was heavily mined around where the front lines used to be, so you couldn't just walk around freely in the forests, because you could step on a mine. If you wanted to go out into nature, you had these exact places where you could go, where battles weren't fought, because there were no mines there. There were also ads on TV, teaching children not to pick up any objects they find, and not to wander off into the forest, or go into abandoned buildings, because of the mines. And we had these demeaning teams come to our schools, to show us what mines and bombs look like. You would be surprised to see all the things that could be made into a bomb. Pens, stuffed toy bears, etc. When Czechoslovakia separated into Czech Republic and Slovak Republic, I was quite young and had no idea what was going on. Then suddenly, they started teaching us slightly different geography at school. But apart from that, and a few bitter remarks from some adults, that was all. What I do remember, though, is that almost all the textbooks we got in school were written in the time of Czechoslovakia and no one bothered to change them for up-to-date versions, so we were often asked to cross out Czechoslovakia from the text and write Czech Republic above it, or draw a thick line between Czech and Slovak republics in a map. That was during the first 9 years of school, at least. Otherwise, I think Czechs and Slovaks have still quite the brotherly relationship. For example, there is a huge amount of Slovak students in Czech universities, who later stay to work. I mean, to enroll at VUT you need to, among others, provide a report card from a Czech or Slovak school if you graduated abroad, except Slovakia, some extra paperwork, take a Czech exam if you're a foreigner, except from Slovakia. I had a foreign exchange student from Latvia. He said his family made a lot of money because they sold a tank left on their property. Deleted. I was born in the USSR 2 months before it collapsed, so I don't personally remember anything, but my parents do. Everything was basically chaos. Most of the businesses that were previously funded by the government had no chance of competing with Western businesses, so many of them went bankrupt, and that meant that lots of people, including my father, lost their jobs. And lots of unemployment then led to lots of crime. The 90s were a crazy time full of riots, crimes and violence in many former Soviet countries. My Latvian friend was born in 87, when Latvia was USSR. Her passport stating born in USSR still blows my mind. Breaking Czechia from Slovakia wasn't a big deal. In the shadow of the fall of the communism, one day they were simply gone like a lover in the morning, and that was alright. True that, I was born and raised in Slovakia, but my parents told me it was pretty much overnight. Politicians decided to do so and everyone just went with it. A family friend grew up in East Germany. When she's had too much to drink, she gets very nostalgic about it and even sheds some tears. She is very defensive of East Germany and says that as a child it was amazing. Another family friend is from Czech Republic, and my boyfriend and his brother are from Slovakia, all born before the split. None of these guys seem to care. They say it's still just the same to them. That is so interesting. What is it about East Germany that she loved or feels the need to defend? Deleted. Yeah, my great uncle was one of those POW Pakistanis. My uncle still bears a grudge. It was really hard for him, since his family were double refugees essentially, when they fled India and became refugees and then East Pakistan to eventually becoming refugees again in West Pakistan. We have a pretty large family, but even then my dad's side were all still refugees living in slums in Karachi. He eventually joined the Air Force as an officer himself after his mom got cancer, so he could support her and his siblings. He is very rich now, so I guess there is a happy ending. On a more light-hearted note, relatively speaking, in my mom's side of the family my grandparents were planning to move to West Pakistan in 1971 and had booked passage on a boat since they weren't very rich. However, one of my two aunts who were very young at the time had breathing problems, I think asthma, so my great aunt, Nan's sister, offered to take care of her while my nan went by boat. He was planning to move to Pakistan by plane about 2 months later, since they were more wealthy. That was in late January. War broke out in March. By the time my great aunt made it to West Pakistan, my aunt was 12 and didn't even know her mom was her mother's sister. Kicker was that she had a twin. She didn't even get a chance to be in denial, since she had her identical sister to rationalize. She still calls my nan Kalajan, dear aunt. She lives in Saudi Arabia now and still is much more subdued than her fiery sister. She never really got over it. My husband was born in the GDR, East Germany, and although he is ambivalent about the positives and negatives of the system, he is still sad to effectively not be able to return to the country he grew up in. Nothing is the same there since the collapse of communism. There is a name for that feeling in Germany: Ostalgie. Ost means East in German. Deleted. I was born in 70s, and I can still clearly remember everything, how my country Yugoslavia fell apart. There is a reason why the former Yugoslavs, Bosnians in particular, are the most vocal about the global democratic backsliding and specifically the US descent to unlawfulness. I'd listen if I were you. We learned all of this the hard way. To be specific, watching Yugoslavia fall apart was exactly like now watching US fall apart. One by one. social norms and checks and balances of federal state being ignored and nobody gives a damn. Strongman mobilizing his followers with dog whistle announcements. Back on TV then, on Twitter now, common folk not responding because civil war is unthinkable and relying on some part of the system to stop all that. Then one day you wake up and state is no more and people shoot at you or the federal army that you paid from your own taxes or your life is shelling your city. Obligatory thank you for the gold and all-seeing awards. I certainly didn't mean to upset people and start yet another Trumpian debate on Reddit. For those interested to read more about the link between the current US situation and old Yugoslavia, there's a great Bosnian American writer, Sasha Heman, who writes about these things much more eloquently than I can, and he's been very active since Trump first came to prominence. On Twitter he's Sasha Heman and here's some of his articles if you're interested. Fiendcept Rolling Stone love you all, and I hope I was wrong about all this. This right here. The US is following this blueprint to a T. One of the main reasons I'm emigrating. The US is headed to a very dark place. I don't plan on being here when it gets there. I used to live in East Germany. It was a relief. My mom lived in East Germany, but she was in East Berlin when the wall came down. So that was obviously immediate and intense. If you live somewhere else, and maybe further away from the border, were there still immediate changes? I was born and still live in one of the ex-Yugoslav republics, Slovenia. I was 3 months old when we declared independence, so I don't remember how the country's fragmented, but I do remember the Bosnian War and the influx of refugees, although I didn't really understand it as a kid. The thing that personally affected me the most about the dissolution of Yugoslavia were the constantly shifting maps. Every year in school we had new maps and each one was different. When you looked at the area of Serbia, the reason I'm writing this is because the whole Yugoslav past still has far-reaching consequences in our lives, mainly in the political spheres. Many politicians who were around at the time of the breakup are still active, and the people are harshly divided about the Yugoslav past of the country. Some suffered during the socialist era, and some prospered. Some see it as a great time and some view it as this horrible oppressive regime. It's especially bad when the time immediately after WW2 is brought up, because that was the time of, well, changes and horrible actions from the new government's side. And naturally, the politicians try to appeal to one of those groups. It's come to the point where these types of things eclipse every actual problem in the country. There are issues with our public healthcare? Well, who cares? The opposition to the reforms are communists, and suddenly that's what everyone talks about. There are issues with taxing the independent workers? Sure, but have you heard about a statue that was unveiled for victims of after-war killings? That's what we should talk about. Every single issue is swept away by just shifting the focus to something that happened in the time of Yugoslavia, and who did what, and who deserves to be punished, and people who actually lived through those times just eat that shiz up. Especially the boomers, cause they were directly impacted by the end of the war. Well said. I hate how they are constantly, and yes I mean constantly, digging up the past instead of focusing on the problems. Also the constant bragging, which was apparently mandatory back then. We are apparently the best country when it comes to corona prevention. Our factory is doing way better than the other one. And OFC the politics. Every time the presidential party changes all the directors are switched out. But then again I'm just ranting right now. So my story is like a breakup that didn't happen, but some 55 years later it's still better. So Maldives, small islands in the Indian Ocean no one knew about. Especially back then cause no tourism. We are made up many atolls. An atoll is a group of islands. In our case it's about 200 small islands on average in an atoll. All the atolls are scattered. Interestingly, atoll is from the Maldivian word atholhu. Anyways, after the Brits left us because they are so good at protecting lol, there was tension between the three southernmost and the rest of the country. South was economically prospering, but they didn't want to pay taxes to the government. The Brits armed the Southerners, but the South didn't want to take arms against their brothers. They made a Republic of Suvadives. Government heard about it, and there was a lot of tension, but no civil war. People were displaced. The main island, which was the economic capital, got ransacked. That's where my grandmother is from. Recently I went there for work, and told them I'm the grandson of her. so people welcomed me as their own. It's like everyone has a lot to say against the people from the capital. There's still hostility in their minds, but the times have changed. A majority of the people live in male capital, however they still really want independence. On another note, documents from the British Foreign Ministry shows that their intention was to make a British military base in the south. Since they couldn't do it, they did it to our neighbors Yugoslavia. Pretty much a takeover. Sent the people to a different country on boats, and they still live in poverty. On top of that, the island was sold to American army. So it's good we didn't get split and they didn't get annexed. So I'm an American who imports tuna. I've worked and visited the Maldives multiple times a year and talked to people there every day for the last 7 years. No one told me about this, but a lot of interesting Maldives information seems to kinda come out offhand rather than right away from locals I've noticed. I was born just around the dissolution of Czechoslovakia, but I have heard from many people who experienced it that it was very peaceful. Basically, Slovakia wanted their own state because they are a separate nation and their language is different, though we understand each other, and they also were not thrilled that all the political decisions were being made in Prague, so Slovakia was a bit forgotten at times. Our two countries still have very good relationships, and although we make fun of each other, we are buddies. Most of you guys anyway had a Slovakian builder working next door, UK, and he was like, I like most people, but I hate Czech people. I'm like, calm down man, seems a bit weird to go to the UK, where there will also be Czech people, and be like, hey, I hate you. My country still exists, but it's not the same before revolution. People did revolution to just duck themselves. Poor people are still poor, and the more flattery and religious you are, you get a better position. You guess it where I'm from, Iran? Doesn't exactly answer the question, but the breakup of the Eastern Bloc and USSR affected capitalist countries on the other side of Iron Curtain as well. We had a mild recession in Finland during the early 90s, since USSR was an important business partner during Cold War and now it was gone. Thought he mild deregulation of the banking sector in the 80s, allowing even the smallest businesses to take out foreign loans, probably was the bigger cause. I was born in Romania in 96, so way after the collapse of communism, and even though Romania always was its own nation, it was also just a Soviet satellite state, so the USSR always had influence over there. Anyhow, my mother told me many stories about her time growing up before the collapse, and what happened during and after. When she reminisces, she's always telling a positive story, saying good things about her upbringing and way of life. But of course after the collapse everything went to chiz immediately. Comparing my childhood to the way things are now, however, things are much better. People flocked out of the country in search of a stable home, since they were finally allowed to travel freely, and you can imagine how that alone inhibited the rate at which the country could grow and prosper. But yeah, chiz was crazy. People became more bitter, since everyone was fighting for scraps and politicians were trying to establish a new government for the first time in decades. Corruption never left, because it was a Soviet way of life and thieves accepted things to remain the same. Until now the damage still exists, but luckily the country has improved significantly, especially after our ascension into the EU. Last year when HBO released the limited series Chernobyl, I decided to watch it with my mother and she became incredibly nostalgic and shed some tears, because I believe for the first time in a long time, she started to clearly see the faults of the way of life in communist Eastern Europe. Everything from the atmosphere to the way of life to the corruption to the behavior, all touched a long lost part of her upbringing. From what I hear, Romania has improved significantly, even in the last few years. Seeing huge billboards for Coca-Cola in Bucharest was a bit strange though, especially given the background. I miss Panji. How old are you, man? I was born in the Canal Zone and grew up there. Came to the US to go to college. The Canal Zone was a territory of the United States that was given to Panama. Though I was a 8 at the time, I still remember clearly when the Canal Zone police was disbanded. Grew up with an intense dislike of Jimmy Carter and hated the changeover from being policed by American police officers to being policed by the PDF. The first day of the start of the implementation of the treaty on October 1st, 1979, high-ranking government officials from Panama drove around Balboa in a mini convoy. They were honking their car horns and in general celebrating. We Americans in Balboa at the time did not like this. According to street maps, my neighborhood had a shortcut way to get onto the Thatcher Ferry Bridge, but it had been fenced off and long unused. The drivers in the convoy didn't know this, and there was a bit of backup and confusion when they attempted to get onto the bridge from my neighborhood. We laughed about this. It was our only solace that day. I live in a country that has never existed, North Cyprus. We go under the name the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus, but we are only recognized by Turkey. Edit. This comment got a lot of hate for some reason. I just stated the fact that I was a Turkish Cypriot, that's it. There are thousands upon thousands of stories about how people from both sides suffered during the 1974. For example, the wooden door at my grandma's living room has a square replacement with an of a different color. During the conflicts, there was a live grenade thrown from the balcony, through that door, and into the kitchen. My aunt was in that kitchen, and a live grenade blew up meters from her. Like I said before, there's both sides to a story. I'm in no way, shape or form saying that Greek Cypriots are bad people. In fact, here the very opposite. I love them. The past is in the past. We must find a way to unite Cyprus and have peace. I'm personally attending bi-communal youth activities with hundreds of Greek Cypriots to promote peace and unite Cyprus, and I have made tons and tons of friends. So, I'm begging you, please don't start hating towards someone just because of their nationality. Fascism is the last thing I want to experience today. How is the relationship with the southern part? Is there a lot of hostility? I grew up in Yugoslavia. I remember the death of Tito, the JBTZ trial, the rise of Milovic culminating in the infamous 14 Congress of the CPJ. Our delegation was outvoted by the Serbs, and instead of taking it, they left and that was it. Our politicians showed some real balls and we were quite proud of them. The year was crazy exciting. In December there was an independence referendum. The results were announced on the 26th of December from the town hall in Ljubljana. The small square was packed, and amongst the holiday decorations we were huddled together, thousands of us, waiting for the result. It was 95% for independence. Now the cheese really hit the fan. Preparations began and June 25th was the date we separated from the common state. There were threats from Belgrade, but there was no stopping it. So we went to the large square in front of the Parliament, Republic Square, to see the official ceremony. I had my camcorder with me, and I was filming the whole thing. To get a better shot I moved closer and closer, stepped behind the guards, and then did a walk on the red carpet pretending to be a journalist. So I got a real first-hand look at the event. I heard the "Tomorrow is a New Day" speech, and filmed the PM as he was hustled away from the event. The next day brought war, which made commuting to work a bit of a hail. The ring road was closed by barricades, so we had to take the back roads to get to work. Then the air raid sirens started and we hid. Well, I say we. My sister was on Croatian coast with my grandmother, enjoying some pre-season discount holiday. Thus was the lure of cut price vacation, that they went even as war was looming. So the roads were closed, the tanks started rolling, and my parents decided to go grab my sister. It was only a 3-hour drive, so they haul her and get down to the resort in under 2 hours. Nobody anywhere. They load the girls and head back to the capital. The highway took them past Dananis Hill, which was being shelled by the Yugoslav Air Force. They watched the planes drop their bombs and kept hauling her, pushing our Civic as hard as it would go. And it went. Safe and sound they arrived home in the late afternoon. The next day the washing machine broke. It was still under warranty, but the repair technician refused to come on account of war. My parents did the reasonable thing and loaded up the Civic, and they drove to the service center to have it repaired. Literally drove past burned out barricades. Danger is danger, but warranty is warranty, and they were not going to pay for repairs if they were covered by warranty. War be damned. They returned safely. The washing machine will be fixed the next day. So again the planes flew, and they risked death to get that machine home. When they were gone, the air raid siren started again, and I went with some other kids into the air raid shelter. We hung out for a few hours, and then made my way home. The machine was home, but my parents were nowhere to be seen. I started looking for missing appliances, but they were just looking for me as I went to the wrong air raid shelter. All was good. So with nothing to do I watched TV. The night fell, and my parents went to sleep. It was late, and in the distance I could hear shots. But whatever. We lived in a nice apartment block on the second floor. I was not really worried. Then all of a sudden, something creeps behind me. It was my mother, crawling on all fours, panicked because those distant shots were not as distant as I thought. I guess this is where the war got real for her, and I had to shut down the TV and crawl to bed. It was stupid, but I was not going to argue. Not with the war on. So with nothing to do, we went to check on the war. The news was reporting that a huge tank column was approaching the ring road and we went to check it out. We lived nearby, and so my father and I had a little look eyes. There were truck barricades on a very on-ramp, piled up with gas tanks and frantic defense forces running crazy with all us idiots. I still remember an exasperated lieutenant shouting, "Go home people, this is war, don't you get that?" Everybody ignored him. Then a few dozen ambulances drove by and half an hour later they came back. After a few hours the tanks failed to show, and we went home. We realized just how boring the war could be. Soon we all got bored with the war and we signed a peace treaty. We felt that 10 days was enough war for one lifetime, and we were pretty much over it. I lost a few friends because of the war. Their parents were high-ranking Yugoslav army officials, and it would have been weird if they stayed. So off to Belgrade they went. After the war the world went back to normal. The greatest tragedy was finding an affordable vacation destination as we usually summered in Croatia. But their war still went on, and so we staycationed for a while. Geography lessons got easier I guess. Not so many republics and capitals to memorize. Sometimes we'd get a few refugees but nothing major. Our biggest pet peeve after the war was that the whole world thought Slovenia was unsafe because of the war. But there was no war. We had less than a fortnight of fighting, and even that was mostly children, Yugoslav army, the police and LARPers. It sucked. Since then we went from one economic upheaval to another. At least our governments are as stable as Italian, so we got that going for us. You kind of buried the lead by mentioning only in the very end that you're from Slovenia. I kept wondering which part of former Yugoslavia you might be describing that would allow for the impression that war is boring. But what a great read. If you aren't already you should definitely think about becoming a writer. I appreciate that dry humor of yours and how you find hilarity in tragedy through an entirely subjective perspective. I'm watching it happen right now where I live. The component countries used to get along fine. The economic benefits behind being part of a big cohesive group were great. Recently though nationalism started to appear and foreigners were being blamed for our problems. Once the idea that your tribe are superior appears the definition of your tribe gets smaller. Our democratic process doesn't help because we vote for local representatives rather than being encouraged to think big picture. So we've left the EU to become a small fish in a big pond, and having established the principle, are now considering devolving further into separate countries of Scotland, Ireland, maybe Wales and England. I don't see any issues with that. You should let the Scottish be free. Czechoslovakia was honestly a pretty great country in the 80s, during socialism. Shelves were full, cars were widely available and travel was eased. On top of that military conscription was also a thing, which based on family was meant. Not wanting to sound rude, but you sound like my communist praising grandma. Not I but my grandfather migrated from what became Indian Punjab to Pakistani Punjab. The British divided the country before they left in a hurry after WW2 and the resulting chaos claimed a lot of lives. The train that was taking him to Lahore was stopped on the way and looted by goons. If you didn't have money, they would slice you up with swords and daggers. He told me of other trains that arrived full of dead bodies. This is just his personal story. Read up about the 1947 partition of India if you want. As an Indian, if this guy's grandfather was only looted, he might have been on one of the luckiest trains of the partition. He told me of other trains that arrived full of dead bodies, only dead bodies. Entire trains of them. On both sides. If you're planning to read about partition, be prepared. I was born in USSR, 1982, in Ukraine. The breakup itself was not a big deal, actually. There were little patriotic feelings of the great country to mourn about. The change from planned communist mode was disastrous, true, but that is a separate thing from the breakup. I was small, but my parents were like nah, whatever, about the breakup, having more concerns about the economics change. I think their reasoning was like federalization / less centralization of power was somewhat good thing, but not a big deal. My parents are from Croatia, but they didn't live in Yugoslavia in 1991. But they regularly visited their families. My dad was glad when Croatia declared independence. My mother's family was more concerned since they were living in Dalmatia. My mom told me this story that on the day Milan Babic declared the state of war over the Krajina, her family fled their homes the same day, but my dad, he wanted to see what is happening there, so he decided to drive to Benkovac, a town occupied by Serb rebels. He thought of it as an adventure, but they could have easily killed him if they found out that he was a Croat. Luckily, nothing happened to him and he returned. My mother grew up in East Germany. In 1989 she was 21 years old and fled the country when the Austrian-Hungarian border was briefly open and East Germans could get that way to the west. She left everything behind, her friends, her family, her mother. She illegally left the country in the belief that she'd never see any of those people ever again. 4 weeks after the flight, the wall in Berlin fell. So looking back, all the effort to leave the country was pretty useless. She said it was weird. Many East Germans couldn't handle the newly gained freedom of living in a Western country, unified Germany. But overall it was a great thing that the wall fell and both parts reunited. She gets very emotional when talking about that time. I was born in Yugoslavia, and it was like losing your limbs together. They had so much potential, but alone they were destined to fail. Wonder how long America has left. WSA or Cascadia, which I think is better, forever. It is supremely sad to lose your nation. I was born in HK, so I was British subject, which is great because we are big Anglophiles, and almost all our best students go to UK universities. But now we are forced to take China's nationality, which is revolting, since that country's moronic leaders and compliant citizens were a complete joke to hawkers. Just reference any HK movie made about China in the 1970s. The political situation has sunk so low in HK, it's like the inmates have taken over the asylum. No words to say about the current situation. I can only hope and pray that the situation in Hong Kong would end. Yugoslavia. Hope there would be no war, and they let us go peacefully and become an independent country, but they wanted war and aggression, and destroyed many historic buildings and cities, and killed a lot of friends and family. Constant worrying if they would come back, cause you did not hear from them for weeks. The result is an independent country, and for that I'm happy. But many do not acknowledge what happened, especially the politicians. UK here, ask me again in a couple of years. I was 9 when the wall came down. At first this was absolutely great. We could now travel to the west, got all those shiny things we only knew from West German television. Then the duck-up started. A lot of people lost a big chunk of their savings due to the currency changeover and then lost their jobs. Profiteers streamed into Eastern Germany and screwed people over because they were way too trusting and naive. It took a lot of years to unify East and West Germany, and after 30 years some people are still struggling. For me it was the best that could have happened. A lot of things could have been handled better, but the overall outcome is still one of Germany's greatest achievements. How was life between the wall coming down and the official reunion of both German countries? Did they act like different states at all, or was a mere formality being solved? I'm from Kosovo, former province of Yugoslavia. This is my parents' perspective. They miss some aspects of the life in Yugoslavia before the war, but also remember the discrimination that my nation faced. Seeing the country fall apart left them with the feeling of uncertainty, while the life conditions got worse every day. And then, in 1989 a new Yugoslavia emerged, a Yugoslavia hijacked by ultranationalism. In 1998 the war began. Shiz hit the fan. My mum remembers going to sleep every night and hearing the gunfire in distance, with the uncertainty of whether she will live tomorrow or not creeping through her skin. Horror stories were circulating about villages getting completely burned and the inhabitants slaughtered, and my family feared that they will be next. Money was scarce, food was dwindling, and the feeling of uncertainty just kept getting worse and worse. Later, we were able to flee and went in a refugee camp in Macedonia. My first photo ever is in the refugee camp. After the war, things calmed down, but the conflict just won't go away. Growing up, we were constantly reminded not to point our gun toys to international forces, and not to wander in the forest, because of the mines. In essence, it was a very cheesy feeling. The people went from relative safety to complete madness and anarchy within a decade. Personally, I feel we are all better off separated. I would love to see the photo in the camp. Well, I'm from Montenegro, and I prefer it a lot that we are independent than to be with Serbia again. I was born in the 90s, so I don't remember idyllic Yugoslavia that was under Tito, but I definitely didn't like our last version of Yugoslavia with just Montenegro and Serbia, so as far as I'm concerned I like it more as independent. I don't have good memories of Yugoslavia in the 90s. Nowadays there are a lot of political issues in both countries I'd say, but it just feels better. It's a small country, but I like it. Balkan will always be Balkan, I guess. Balkan will always be Balkan, I guess. Ain't that the truth? Lol. I'm from North Macedonia and we didn't have that much problems breaking up. Even though we didn't participate in the war, my father was in the JNA, Serbian military, and fighting on their side. Many Macedonians were sent in the war, but luckily my father fled from Serbia and he didn't see the tragic ending. Is it also applicable for any Asian countries? How about Indian subcontinent? Anywhere, anytime, just share your story. I was born in Sarajevo, Yugoslavia in the 80s. I was a wee lad when the war started. It was confusing at first, but luckily my father did not mess around. He put my mom, grandmother, and I on the last airplane out if the city before the airport was shut down, and the city went under siege. I experienced the war as a refugee going from Belgrade to Zagreb to Newm to Dubrovnik. Each place had their own pent-up hatred for another ethnicity or two. I had to always pretend to be on the majority side as we moved. I would get asked by other kids and parents about my family, their names and backgrounds. I had to go to church and take religion classes in some places to fit in. It was weird how all the kids hated their classmates just because their parents passed the hatred down. The weird part was everyone, even us in 3rd grade, was aware of the ethnic cleaning, villages being burned, and people being killed senselessly. Going back has been strange. Each place I would go to, they would be confused by my accent. In Croatia, I would sound Serbian. In Bosnia I would sound Croatian. In Herzegovina I would sound Bosnian. So I would never be able to fit in. My wife and I got married in Croatia, and I hope that one day we travel with our son, where some of the weirdness can be gone, and that we can show him all of the historic sites and the beauty of the Dalmatia without a fuss. P.S. Thanks on the question, Opus. Made my morning a bit brighter thinking about my childhood, and knowing my son will not have to endure anything of what I've been through. Asking for 330 million friends? I was born in Croatia, at the time still a part of Yugoslavia. I have nothing but good memories of the neighbors, friends, teachers, store folk. I can write all day long. We had things, not as colorful as other nations, but we didn't starve. We had clean clothes, and we had fun. Talk about trips, vacations, kicking the ball around, whatever a kid would do. Like I said, good memories up to a point where suddenly you were told not to go there, not to do this, not to go out, and the list goes on. At the time I had no idea why. I mean, I understood what was happening, but had no idea why it was happening. The teachers changed their grading scales. The folks were no longer interested in playing with me. The obvious rage and hatred was building up on a daily basis. Classmates were harried, beaten up after school/in school. It became horrible very quickly. Girlfriends? Good luck with that. Yesterday I was helping neighbors build their garage, mixed concrete, carried bricks, but today I get spat on for doing absolutely nothing but having a certain last name with a certain geographical background. My dad served in the army, on the front lines, as a Serbian fighting on the Croatian side. I was there with him once, on a hill with a guided missile system called Maljudka. It was super easy to operate, and I remember when we were on that hill overlooking a forest, both sides knew if the move was made, no way anyone was crossing that valley alive. Forest was covered, valley was open, and covered by the missile system. It was a standstill. And when I saw reflections of binoculars in the forest, my question was, why don't you shoot at them? His response was, because we don't want to. Those are people with kids and families who don't want this. There is a video on YouTube about a very young guy attacking Slovenia. He just woke up and was sent to go there, shoot at his neighbors, and he broke down. Folks were just caught in a wild rage storm, and it was a marker. War is hell. People lost so much and some will never recover. The biggest problem is that for some the war never ended. Croatia got slaughtered and had nothing to defend itself for a very long time, and now, with the war over, I bet there is a very limited amount of households without guns and ammo hidden away, just in case it happens again. At least this time there is a fighting chance. What happened after the break is interpreted differently by different sides. I don't think people are giving the mind defused teams, my dad did this after the war, enough credit. The ways the mines were placed, where they were placed, how the village folks were grateful for folks to clear the field for them. I have nothing to say, but mine laying people are human scum and the defused teams are something to aspire to. Reality is, people still hate each other, but only on the Balkans. My job allowed me to travel a lot, and anytime I see anyone outside the Balkans I'm greeted with brother/neighbor, because that is how we were raised. All nationalities were brethren, all people were treated with respect, and the same mentality is present with XU folks outside the XU states. What really hurts is that reading the comments here, I see that others share the same. Stay safe folks, remember that wars are ran by old grey-haired politicians in the warmth of the leather armchairs, and the common folk get the blunt of it sleeping in basements, getting grey hair after bombardments, and wake up with irrational fears even years on. If you're ever in Dublin, drop a message, I'd be happy to go for a drink and serve a pee. Does South Africa count? The country basically broke up and reformed entire provinces. Names of entire cities were changed. People were granted freedom to live in any area. I imagine it was crushing for those who liked the country like it was before they know of, and lived in a country I'll never happily see, even though I was born only 2 years after it was obliterated. My great-great-grandfather died in 2003, and I will represent him in this thread because of the year and era he was born in. He was born under the last decade of the Spanish Empire, and his bigger brother was born in the last 2 decades of it. He tells me how that he had high hopes during the last decade of the Spanish Empire as things were actually improving. More individual liberties, more rights to the colonies, more industrialization, railway system, stronger economy, more education, and just a better life in general. Even though the Spanish Empire was not the same as its glorious past, it still was prideful and capable. However, everything changed when the Spanish-American War started. Many people are led to believe that Cuba and Puerto Rico and almost all of the last colonies of Spain and America became better after the war. That's such a lie. All of the hard work made into modernizing Puerto Rico and Cuba and incorporating them as autonomous regions of Spain was in vain, especially for him, as he and the rest of Puerto Rico to this very day we don't have the right to vote in the general election. He told me that many family was divided, and when he came back to Spain to visit the family, everything changed. The atmosphere was gloomy, politics was tense, literally it was the worst 3 decades for Spain for many years to come. Many people in Spain before the war used to wear more colorful Victorian clothing, but after the war, and for many years up until maybe when Franco became dictator, many people wear black clothing as a way to grieve their loss. He told me that during the 1910s people mocked Spain because it lost the war and became something that it wasn't never before. In fact, though the rumor of American racism to the extent of seeing Italian, Spaniards and even Irish as the same, or almost as black people, was not true until he was discriminated when he visited for a business trip in New York City. He is obviously white. Unlike those who lived in Yugoslavia and the USSR, the Spanish Empire lived over more than 400 years or so. So most of the Spanish identity back then came from their imperial past and how they had almost all of the Americas. It's like Britain today, to say the least. Industrialization growth slowed down, and things got worse up until maybe Franco. He stayed in Puerto Rico due to his business there. However, his hates toward the US persisted even through my family to this day. He was ashamed about his island, and how wronged he was to believe that way before the war, though the US was their traditional ally. Because Spain helped the US gain independence to people, in fact more than France. He told me that most Puerto Rican and Cubans though as themselves first as Spaniards, and then Cuban/Puerto Rican. And he was even more ashamed to see WW1 and WW2, and the Cold War. He told me that of all the periods that he felt the worst uncertainty was WW2, and the one filled with most emotion or provoked him the most was the Cold War. He had business in Germany or Prussia, a small factory for sugar plantation machinery. He supported Germany because he saw Germany as a big middle finger to the Allies' power, as he believed in the balance of power, just like many people of his generation and before. My great-grandfather and my grandfather both supported and fought for Franco and Hitler in the Blue Division. My great-grandfather, unlike my grandfather, because he was young and my great-grandfather didn't wanted his son to die, sent him back to Spain and eventually to Puerto Rico. My great-grandfather stayed back fighting in Germany and eventually becoming a smuggler for many Germans, Jews, Poles into Spain, whoever had money, unless their kid or a family. However, when they heard and saw the Holocaust they were outraged. My great-great-grandfather told me that Jews were seen as the same as Gypsy, albeit more educated and professional. And when he heard and saw the picture of the bodies, he thought that wasn't possible, that was fake, or that was just civilian casualty or a minor marker at first. When he realized and my grandparent, they felt sick about this fact. However, they told me that they weren't impressed with the bodies, the markers, and the horror of war. But rather the industrial effort made into extermination. That the Cold War for him demonstrated the hypocrisy of the US to a all new level. How is it possible, you mess people? Why you promise democracy to the world when you're replacing democratically elected people with people who are cruel and not knowledgeable just because they're pro-America? Because of the Cold War he hated even more the US and some American that was born way before the Spanish-American War, also though about the same thing. It didn't bother for him if you conquer and are trying to find glory, but it's wrong for him that the foundation of your country is based on freedom and not glory, unlike that of Spain and Britain. He find it wrong, like many Americans from his generation, to literally ignore your own pride, the US Constitution, into other people's rights. Many people from his generations viewed the US positively and as source of enlightenment. He saw the huge construction works made during the 50s and 60s in Puerto Rico and the reindustrialization of the island. However, he was very wary of it because he questioned why make highway and destroy the railway that goes around the island? Why highway if we can improve on what we already have? He saw the Americanization and the consumer culture came to be, which he enjoyed a lot, but then find it odd, something in which he concluded is just a way to entertain the real problem of the world. The idea of cars being for the rich, something he had always, was long gone. Women have rights, something he actually liked. He tells me that quality of life improved compared to that of the 1940s. Telephone for everybody, he is used to have it, because again only the rich could afford it, and more stuff. And he saw war-torn nations like Germany, Italy, and Japan rise up once again. FYI, he told me that things made in either Japan or Italy back then was considered like those things made in China in general, made of bad quality. Even though he always had Mercedes-Benz, Rolls-Royce, Porsche, and some Ferrari, he liked comfortable cars. But he felt like he always was making a sin during all of this period, because he felt that it was like a certain type of gluttony, the new culture. He always asked himself how in the world he hasn't died at all yet when the 2000s came. In the 90s, his view in the US became more positive than ever until Iraq and Afghanistan happened. I had the privilege to spend a lot of time with him. He loved me more than any other person in this world ever had, and even though I might look different, he loved me a lot. Every single day I came to him, and he took care of me at his age. He always said to me that I'm the future, and that I'm the last hope of humanity. He also had an opinion about global warming, and from what my dad told me, he said that it's so true, that Puerto Rico used to be cooler and Spain too. I still miss him a lot, and I will always have his heart in my heart. He was a tough dude, and lived a life full of pain and joy, as he saw the fall of his identity and nation to the rise of new nations and falls. Czechoslovakia. It was beautiful. We used to not have so much things and the rivalry between us was still there. When we merged, Slovakia had like 3 schools across the whole country. I was 3 when Yugoslavia fell apart, so I don't remember how it was before that, but I can definitely say that way too many people didn't get over it, because 30 years later people are still fighting about it, and it's one of main points that keeps the population polarized, us and the mentality. Where the Rhodesians be at. My friend's grandparents were Rhodesians. They seem pretty heartbroken about what became of that country. They weren't big fans of institutional racism, but they still loved their country. They have a plaque of the country on their wall showing what parts they had visited, and some other things that apparently the government would give to Rhodesian citizens. And now it's an absolute disaster thanks to Mugabe, with no industries and people starving. I was 8 living in Croatia when Yugoslavia broke down. Unfortunately, majority is still poisoned by hatred and divided by nationality, religion or past doctrines, fascist/communist. Do parents count? My dad lived in East Pakistan until he was about 6 years old, and that's when it was freed and called Bangladesh. I'm told that there's now a generational split. Those who lived under rule have terrible memories and usually support one party, and those born after it, 70s and further, are more sympathetic to the extremist side because they didn't live it. I'm not from there myself, but I wonder if Somalia would be another valid example. It is still depicted on maps, but that has been a fiction since the 1990s. What is actually there within the former borders is Somaliland, Puntland, the Shabab Empire, and the city-state of Mogadishu. Not me, but my parents. My parents were born in the late 1940s, in the state of Vietnam. They grew up in South Vietnam. On April 30th, 1975, the Vietnam War ended, South Vietnam ceased to exist, and Vietnam was unified under communist rule. It was a very chaotic time. Everyone was scared of the communist reprisals that would come once the communists took over. Once they took over, they rounded up everyone who worked for the old regime and sent them to re-education camps, often 4 years at a time, so that they can learn the new socialist way of life. My dad, who was a policeman, was in the camps for 7 years. My mom was allowed to visit him during this time and bring him supplies. My uncle died in these camps. All cultural products produced in the South prior to 1975 were banned from circulating. Even now only those songs, movies, books, etc. that are whitelisted can be shown or performed. The economy was collectivized, and there was near famine in the late 1970s and early 1980s. Millions of people fled the country using crudely made boats, creating an international humanitarian crisis. In 1986, faced with certain ruins, the government allowed some economic and political reforms. Since then, the country had improved economically, although the Communist Party still keeps a tight grip on things. Well, one side said I want all the money, the other side said that they own all the money, then each side said that they owned all the eats. But the worst thing is that I had to decide which side I wanted to be on. I didn't know what to do, so I moved out and never saw either one of them again. Damn, my parents were assholes. I live in Republic of Moldova, that was part of the Soviet Union, and even if it's a little bit better, life here is still hard. I lived for 3 months in Nesperini, Moldova, and I think the people there were so amazing, and the country is beautiful. It is a shame how bad everyone has it, but I saw people helping each other much more than they ever would in the US. I hope I can return soon, in Romania now. I miss watching Team Yugoslavia in FIBA. I was born in 1985 in Mikovic, Yugoslavia. Mikovic is now part of Croatia. My mom was Croatian and my dad was Serbian. I still consider myself as Yugoslavian. I was only a kid, but I do remember uncles and cousins getting killed over the years while the war was raging. As for my immediate family, we moved around a lot. We lived in Cyprus for 6 months until they deported us. We then moved to Belgrade, Serbia. From there we went to Romania. We lived there for 2 years and once again moved back to Belgrade and applied to come to Canada. We were accepted, and in September 1995 we arrived to Calgary, Canada. I now live in Windsor, Ontario, Canada. Was born in the German Democratic Republic and lived near a major Air Force base close to Berlin. Grandfather was a cop and many neighbors were professional soldiers. It was quite wild in the early 90s. The exchange rate from mark to D-mark was pretty damn generous, which led to lots of people suddenly having money and a formerly unimaginable plethora of things it can be spent on. Things that used to be absolute luxury were suddenly worthless and simply thrown out or practically given away. My mom bought an almost new Trabant for 1 Deutschmark in 1992. A couple of years ago you had to wait a decade for the mere chance to pay 10,000 mark. Many people burned through their life savings in a couple of months because they couldn't get enough of the newly available luxury. There was also a ton of unemployment shortly after the reunification because state-owned factories and businesses were bought up for cheap by West German investors that radically restructured or simply dismantled them. East German specialists had to take menial jobs because their degrees weren't recognized by the new authorities, despite being equal in terms of requirements. Many people were happy about the reunification and the switch to capitalism, but just as many wished they could return to their old lives after the novelty wore off. Bosnian here. Hard. I was born in Wiesbaden, West Germany, now just Germany, and really it's just kinda a novelty of thought. I don't have any strong feelings about it. Maybe because the country itself still exists? It was just like my breakup. Quick and full of men who wanted power. I live in New Zealand. Not joking, we are being forgotten from around 80% of world maps. I just don't see it. I live in Lithuania, ex-USSR part. We were like the first ones to get out of USSR. I have heard a lot of stories from my parents, grandparents, and been in like all museums. My parents were really happy cause they lived so badly, a lot of deficits and low economy. After breakdown we build it up and now we are really civilized country. And we have like celebration like each month for it. Not me, but my parents lived in what was previously known as East Pakistan, now Bangladesh. East Pakistan was mostly an authoritarian regime that treated the Bengali people like second-class citizens, but still wanted to tax the population to support the regime. There was a lot of bloodshed to gain independence. My dad was imprisoned for being a traitor to the country when joining up with the rebels, but he was lucky. After incarcerating the first rebels, others were later in the war just shot. My mother fled here home with her family, and she recalls bodies just stacked on top of each other. The saving grace for Bangladesh was a Pakistani journalist who was sent to report that Pakistan was doing nothing wrong. But upon seeing the atrocities, he sought protection, fled to another country, and reported what he saw. Then India decided to step in, and since India is so powerful, and is just in between the two countries, it was no longer possible to continue. One could say that the reason it wasn't really meant to last was because their union was quite unnatural to begin with. When the British left, the country was just divided based on religion, and even though Bangladesh and Pakistan are quite far apart and somehow culturally different, they were now joined into one country. Most people in Bangladesh were happy to gain independence, but now alt-right Muslim extremists are gaining momentum and some would even want to see Bangladesh rejoining Pakistan to make a supreme Islam country. Czechoslovakia. It felt quite natural to break apart, really. Very peaceful. The only reason why Czechoslovakia existed was that after WW2 the Allies wouldn't agree to have two so small countries as separate and would divide the land between other countries, or one of them will disappear completely. So to avoid that, the politicians made an agreement. Most of the industry was located in Czech part, and that's why they had more power while countries were joined. We still call each other brothers, except when we play ice hockey and our newly elected presidents visit the other country before any other. I was born after the war, but my parents told me a lot of stories, so here is few of them. Sorry for bad English. Before my dad went to war, him and mom were traveling around Bosnia, that area of ex-U. when they were heading back to their city, not knowing that war had already started in nearby cities. They almost drove into open war zone in one village. Thank God they spotted a guy running and waving to them to go back. After that my dad went to war and my mom was hiding somewhere in the mountains with other people. Dad was going to many cities and his most shocking story he told us about is the time when they were deployed to some unknown small village where Turkish soldiers were training them. Long story short, Turkish soldiers were very unfriendly and they forced them to exercise, pray and respect their rules. I don't know how they escaped, he never told us, but they managed to. Dad's cousin was in the first lines and he confessed to us that they would give tons of drugs and alcohol to soldiers. Mom's cousin was a photographer during the war. He still has images and videos till this day, but he never published most of it, and he is mentally scared for life. He drinks a lot, and he is out of this world. My grandfather was robbed and shot but he survived. My aunt's husband was almost killed in the middle of nowhere. He was drunk, and he passed out on some field near border. My mom had no food, and no money to escape to other country. She would say how horrible those times were. There were many stories, but I told few of them. 22 years ago I moved to the former Confederate States of America. It's been 160 years and some of these people are still flying the old flag. Talk about a grudge. Let it go already. I think OP is trying to get an idea of how us in the US are gonna feel in the near future. Deleted. So it is about my parents / mostly my father. Back in Yugoslavia, Albanians were a minority, but still populated in southern Yugoslavia, mostly living in Macedonia. My father said it was a terrible time in the breakup, since Macedonia heavily relied on the economy of Yugoslavia, and as the Serbs made war with a lot of country and my dad's dad being in the military with little supplies and food for my family, it was awful. My father lived a long life without his dad, which is kinda sad as he later didn't want to be in the military anymore, and as most people were very poor in Macedonia, my grandpa tried to support my family in working in another country. As a kid, it always amazed me reading about the Balkan conflicts, because I legitimately could not understand why they hated each other. I guess it's really hard to understand cultural differences when you're not in it. My ex's dad is from Czechoslovakia, when it was its own country. He served in the 2 Chechen wars. He immigrated to America after they lost the second one. Not me, but my friend used to live in New Zealand before it was proven to be imaginary. You can imagine how she felt when she learned she had been in Australia this whole time. As someone who lives in US, Georgia, I see a lot of Confederate monuments still. And I realize this isn't really the answer OP was looking for, lol. But it makes me wonder how many countries have monuments to their old country, or if the new one makes them get rid of it. Not me, but a friend was from Zaire. He was able to leave during the revolution with his family. He said it's weird to no longer live with the country of origin. Surreal. I had the fortune to be born in the best country in the world, or so I thought. From early age I was taught that my country was made up of many different people, all working together in brotherhood and unity. I spent summer and winter holidays all over the country. It was beautiful. To me it was perfect. I was so proud of my country, my people and our history. I had friends in every region that I used to talk on the phone with regularly. I had family living in every corner of the country. Then when I was 11, I came back from a holiday, and it started. I could not believe what I was seeing on TV. Former friends, neighbors, killing each other, married couples splitting, because suddenly they were enemies. My cousins had to come and live with us in our tiny apartment, because their former neighbors shot up their house. While they were in it, they escaped with only their clothes they were wearing. Their house burned down behind them. 9 people sharing a 3-bedroom apartment now. Then the sanctions came. No more imports, no petrol, supermarket shelves were completely empty. You had to queue from 2 AM in front of store, hoping that there will be a delivery at 6 AM of bread and milk, and that you might be lucky to get one before it runs out. I watched elderly pensioners rummage through rubbish bins to find food. Massive inflation meant money lost all value. People lost all savings in banks. stress, anxiety, expecting that the war may spill into my area as well. While the war never did come directly, it spread hate and intolerance, and flooded the country with weapons, criminal organizations wielding axe and uses. Even in my school I could not understand the hate towards refugees that came to our school, kids who have had their homes destroyed like my cousins, and were now being abused for coming from the other, enemy part of the land. I befriended some, and was bullied mercilessly in school. My father and several male relatives had to hide every time when army recruiting came around looking for them, looking to send them to fight in this senseless war. It was like suddenly finding myself in Twilight Zone. All my illusions shattered, nothing I knew and believed true anymore. I left to find a new home, and I'm happy here. But there is always fear that one day, people here will find some silly differences to hate each other over. Religion, nationality, political affiliations. There is no war until brother kills brother, and all wars are civil wars, because all men are brothers. I was born in Serbia, part of Yugoslavia at that time, in a major city a little prior to the NATO bombing. I can't remember anything from that period, but my parents have told me many stories ranging from our families hiding in the basement and us kids crying every time we heard the sirens to basically having no money due to the hyperinflation, which took place about 5 years before the bombing. My family had the chance to move to another country and escape the post-war period, although the physical and psychological damage was already done by that time. When my parents see images or videos from that time, or from the bombings specifically, they get sort of mild anxiety attacks. I'm very happy and thankful to have had the opportunity to move to another country and live a life in peace, with a chance of good education and a decent system as a whole. Pluto was nice. I'm a Serb, and I live in Serbia. I have not consciously witnessed the Yugoslav wars, but here are the things my parents and relatives told me. Due to the international embargo and the sanctions, you typically were not able to buy, or just in extremely limited rations, flour, oil, and sugar. People jokingly abbreviated this as Bush. During the hyperinflation in Serbia from 1992 to 1994, you'd also factually become a billionaire, as the daily inflation rate was 62% and banknotes issued would not value less than tens or hundreds of billions dinars. Nevertheless, the average monthly salary in the country was just about $10, about equal to North Korea today. When the NATO bombing began in 1999, people fled into their basements and children cried as they tried to escape the 153 bombs dropped during the 77-day-long attack. Here in Serbia there was no active ground combat with the exception of the war in Kosovo, but the crisis still affected our nation. Many people left the country and we were politically unstable. Not my story but my grandfather's. He was around 7 years old when India was partitioned, and they had to walk for 5 days, along with a group of at least 1,000 people, from what used to be India, but no longer was, to the nearest village which still was in India. Many among them died from fatigue, hunger, or diseases, but still having a 20% chance of making it to safe grounds was a better option than the sure death that awaited those who stayed behind. Oh boy, I was technically born in Yugoslavia, but I'm a Hungarian, as were my ancestors, from the old Austria-Hungary. After Trianon we were left out in the old Yugoslavia. When I was born it was called Federal Republic of Yugoslavia. Later on in 2006 Serbia and Montenegro broke off, and right now it's Serbia. I'm gonna be honest here, it was a shitshow. However, to me, it didn't matter much since I was kind of meant to be on the sidelines as a Hungarian decent. However, people here were really angry. Kosovo is kind of considered as a holy ground for the Serbians, and I guess you are kind of familiar with the Yugoslav wars. Still to this day, I have no idea what to think about this whole ordeal. I actually just made a username to comment on this. Yugoslavia. I'm a Kosovo Muslim girl who was only 5 years old when the war broke out in my country. During the war I witnessed my home being bombed, my father being assaulted by the Serbian police for putting up the peace sign with his fingers, more graves, and endless violence. One time, while waiting to receive food, buses would drive and throw us bread, etc. A young boy was crying. A Serbian police officer literally cut his ear off and handed it to his mother, While waiting for a bus to take me and my family to the refugee camps, Serb police showed up, starting dividing families apart and throwing them into different buses. They snatched me from my mother's arms and threw me onto one of these buses. I somehow made it to Macedonia. I was too young and afraid to remember how I got there and was able to break away and run to a mosque. That is when I ran into my soon-to-be adopted father and family. When they found me, I was completely traumatized and had no memory of my biological family or the war. Nightmares of it constantly plagued my sleep, but my adopted family did their best to console me and told me they were only bad dreams. One day while my adopted father was reading the newspaper, I just happened to see a photo of my older sister in it. All the memories flooded back into my head, and I remembered my name and family. The Macedonian community, they were helping a lot of Kosovo refugees, came together and were determined to go back into Kosovo and reunite me with my family. By some miracle, one of them happened to stumble across my father, and they set a date and time to meet at a refugee camp. After 2 months, I was finally reunited with my family. We came over to America, all of us together, in 1999. Through all of that experience, my parents taught us all to have love, instead of hate, for Serbian people. That it was the brainwashing of greedy politicians, not the nationality, that was the most responsible. And I'm so thankful they taught me to live with a heart full of love instead of anger. Finally, something I can answer. I was born in 1994, towards the end of the Civil War. Social Federal Republic of Yugoslavia technically dissolved in 1992, but the war didn't end until 1995. So these years are a bit of a grey area. After the war, Yugoslavia still existed, but this time instead of 6 republics, Slovenia, Croatia, Serbia, Bosnia, Montenegro and Macedonia, it consisted of only 2, Serbia and Montenegro, which became known as that at the beginning of 21st century. I was a baby, but I vividly remember the NATO intervention in '99, October 5, 2000. And subsequent years of turmoil. We were given democracy, and it was really hard to adapt to if after Soc communism only we had. The country was struggling because the nationalism which sparked the civil war in the first place, and the Serb refugees who were displaced from Bosnia and Croatia came to Serbia, mostly to Belgrade and Vojvodina, and they were trying to adapt to it. The economy was limping, industry was long gone. Way back at the end of the 80s, so we had a lot of unemployed people and our own refugees for the whole decade of 90s and early 2000s. My hometown had 3 big factories, FAP, I know, being the biggest one. None of them work, not even at the 5th of their capabilities. We are still pretty much struggling. I think Slovenia had it best though, but I love joking that I lived in 2 centuries and 4 countries without changing my address. America was nice at one point. Now it's the United States of corporation corruption. I'm currently watching my country break up as the Chinese military start to invade our territory. The Philippines is slowly becoming a Chinese province. I lived in the United States of America before the Great Split of 2022. Can you imagine not needing a passport to go from Texas to Mississippi? I guess it's a good thing that most of the New England states banded together under one banner, because Rhode Islanders would have been screwed. Also, some interesting facts. There used to be 50 different states instead of the 7 countries we have now. There also used to be only 1 Utah, but there used to be 2 Dakotas. Weird, right? I asked my friend who was born in Yugoslavia about this. Here is what he had to say. Duck you. Born in USSR in late 198X. I obviously don't remember the collapse. But the 199X were basically watching legacy of empire being torn apart. So many abandoned factories. Visiting parents' work where their equipment is being slowly dismantled. Everything was now Russian fault. The SS were now freedom fighters. From ex-Yugoslavia here. Truth to be told, I was born around time country broke, so I have no memory of things that were happening at that time, but I can still say few words about it. First thing is very old, 70 plus, people still feel bad about breakup. My generation doesn't care. It is politically popular for countries to spit one at another during elections, but reality is there is no hate among people. It is just the politicians making it seems as if it is true. I'm from Serbia and you will find very often how we hate Croatians. Well, in my entire life, I never met anyone who really does. And it is the same for Croatians. I've never met a Croatian who hates us. But during elections there is massive spitting by politicians on both sides. If we are going to talk about progress, I would say Slovenia is closest to what normal country should be like among ex-EU countries. Rest of us are just chizchi, and whoever manages to find a way to leave somewhere else they do. I for one would leave if I had an opportunity to go somewhere, and I would never come back. For someone who is tourist on surface it seems nice. Generally people are nice, and there are a lot of beautiful places to see, but this is what it may seem on the surface. Reality is way different. This is not a place where one can have decent life in any way possible. Honestly, if someone would drop nuke and wipe us out from Earth, I would not blame him for doing so. My one takeaway from watching Yugoslavia get destroyed from both within internal factors, with outside influence, peacekeeping / covert operation / meddling / media manipulation, is that I got to hear the story from all sides. Local news, Croat Serb, foreign news, as well as stories from locals that lived through it. Let me just say this, I take any world event that is of similar caliber with a huge pile of salt. E.g. the overthrow of Gaddafi in Libya. That shiz absolutely did not go down as the Western media reported it. I see how the media manipulates the narrative about issues like this. There is a great documentary about the history and Yugoslav war called The Weight of Chains. Do check it out. Oh my, you watched until the end? That's fucking awesome, dude. Thanks for watching.